Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am from Penn State University, and today I'll be presenting on my master's research titled Strategies for Weed Management in Roundup Ready Alfalfa. A little background on Roundup Ready Alfalfa. It was first available from 2005 through 2007, at which point it was removed for a period of 4 years while it underwent several court cases and additional environmental impact studies, and then it was re-released in February of last year. And also, just some facts on Roundup. It's a trade name for glyphosate, which is a broad-spectrum systemic herbicide. And it's extremely popular because anything that it touches as far as living plant material, it is fairly effective at killing, but once it contacts the soil surface, it becomes inactive and has no residual. So why the need for Roundup Ready Alfalfa? Well, the major reason is because of weed competition. And within weed competition, it's especially important with seedling alfalfa. Alfalfa being a perennial, it's relatively slow growing and takes a while to establish. So if there's a large weed population, especially of annual weeds that are very vigorous, they can quickly outcompete the alfalfa for water, light, and other nutrients and cause trouble getting a successful stand established. Also, the quality of forage. Everyone knows alfalfa is a legume, has a high protein content. Many annual weeds, not being legumes, they have a lower protein and also mature quicker, and they really increase the fiber content of a forage when they make up a large part of what you're harvesting. Also, if you have an existing stand of alfalfa, in year 3 or 4, it begins to thin and weeds start reinvading. Having the Roundup Ready gene in your alfalfa allows you to go back in, spray that field with Roundup, and effectively target those weeds and remove them without harming your alfalfa, and again, allowing the alfalfa more resources for increased growth. And finally, economics. Compared to other herbicides that can be used on alfalfa, Roundup's relatively inexpensive to apply per acre, and also the technology is extremely popular in corn and soybean production, so farmers that already have this knowledge could very easily transfer both what they've learned using it and the equipment they already have to apply Roundup to their alfalfa for weed control. I became interested in the uses of Roundup, especially using the gene as a tool for weed management in alfalfa, and especially during the seedling year. And the objectives of this research project were to evaluate early and late spring planting dates, herbicide applications, Roundup and a competitive, and 3 harvest frequencies of 25, 30, and 35 a day. For my materials and methods, plots were laid out in a randomized complete block design with 4 replications. The 2 planting dates were approximately 3 weeks apart, and these were established in the spring of 2010 and 2011. The plots were sprayed at the 3 to 4 trifoliate growth stage with Roundup, and the other product you used was Pursuit. Harvesting was done with a flail harvester. The plot weight was recorded, and subsamples were taken to determine dry matter and later used for quality analysis. That quality analysis was done using near-infrared reflectance spectroscopy, or NIR machine, and we analyzed for crude protein, acid detergent fiber, and neutral detergent fiber. Some of the environmental factors we dealt with over the 2 years, by far the most challenging was the monthly rainfall we experienced. The 30-year average for State College is shown in the black bars. And 2010, represented by the red bars, you can see the rainfall trend followed the average fairly closely. A few years, June and July, below normal, and others near normal. 2011 was a completely different ballgame. It was extremely wet in the spring, which delayed us being able to get in the field and get the plots planted. And then as soon as we got them planted in June and July, the rain pretty much turned off and it got extremely dry. And then later on in the year, August and September, we had a large amount of rain that made it very difficult for us to maintain some of our harvest frequency treatments that we would have liked. And looking at the temperature, it had a much less variable effect. Again, 30-year average is in black, and each year followed the 30-year average fairly closely, being a degree or so above normal. So moving on to my results, this graph and the next few are laid out in the same fashion. 2010 data is shown on the left, 2011 on the right. Alfalfa is represented by green bars, and weeds are represented by red bars. The y-axis is the dry matter yield in kilograms per hectare. And the statistical significance was set at p less than or equal to 0.05. So here we're looking at the yearly yield. And when I say yearly yield, this is the first, second, and third harvest of the year added together to get what you would get off that treatment over an entire year of harvesting. And in each case, during the seeding year, we got 3 harvests per treatment. So in 2010, you can see we had no difference in alfalfa yield, whereas in 2011, it's not showing up here, but this second planting was actually significantly higher than the first. And this was likely because of all that rainfall. Some of our harvest intervals were extended, and we captured more yield than we might have otherwise. The weeds, on the other hand, they both followed the same trend, with the first harvest having more weed yield compared to the second. And the likely reason for this is because when these plots were planted, they were conventionally tilled and prepared. So whenever we prepared the second planting, the 3 weeks in between where weeds were growing, they were effectively controlled and removed through tillage and preparing the seed bed. And again, in 2010, the first planting yielded more for the entire year when you look at the total yield of the alfalfa and weeds combined compared to the second. And in 2011, we found the opposite, mostly because it was dominated by the alfalfa yield in the second planting. When you look at the cutting interval, again, some of my statistical significance wasn't showing up, but between the 25, 30, and 35 day, each one was significantly higher than the other. They were all different, whereas the weeds, there was no statistical difference in the weed yield as you increased the cutting interval, which was relatively surprising. And we found the exact same trend in 2011 with increasing alfalfa yield as you extend the cutting interval, but no increase in weed yield. And likely something's happened between the alfalfa and weeds where the weeds are either maturing and stopping their vegetative growth before 25 days, or else the alfalfa begins to outcompete the weeds and limit their growth before 25 days, that we're not seeing any increase in yield as that cutting interval is extended. And then looking at the herbicide treatments, again, it's not showing up with my alfalfa significance, but the control yielded less alfalfa than the herbicide treatments, which yielded more. The weed yield, as you would expect, yielded a lot more in control than the herbicides, where they were all removed by the herbicide. And we found the same relationship in 2011, where the control here, it yielded less alfalfa than the Roundup or pursuit treatments. The one difference is in the overall yield in 2010, the control treatment, the weeds more than made up for the diminished alfalfa yields. So the control yielded more compared to the herbicide treatments, where in 2011 there was no difference between the treatments as far as total yield. And then before I move on to the next graph, I want you to keep in mind the red bar, and I'm going to try to break out what it means as far as where the yield occurred throughout the year. So this is my weed yield just from the control plots where no herbicide was applied. And we're going to look at the planting dates and the harvest of the year. So first planting dates shown by the green line, and the second planting date by the blue line. And harvest 1, 2, and 3, this is the first, second, and third harvest of the year. So you can see the first harvest of the year in 2010 was the vast majority of the weed yield, and after that first harvest, greatly decreased to the second and third. 2011, on the other hand, had a much lower initial weed yield, and I can partially attribute this to the lack of rainfall we received shortly after planting. The top of the soil surface, top quarter inch, half inch especially, very little soil moisture, so there's probably little little response there from the weeds as far as germination due to lack of moisture to support that. So in a year with closer to normal rainfall, we might expect these points to be lifted up here and then seeing a decrease, following a trend closer to 2010. So as I said before, rainfall was drastically different for the 2 years, and that resulted in some of the issues you see in the 2011 data, especially with the weed yield and the alfalfa yield for the year. The weed content in our plots, it consisted mainly of foxtail species, common lamb's quarters, and pigweed. Potato leafhoppers, they were controlled as needed to prevent damage to the plots and any effects from insect damage to our yields or quality. And pursuit, it did reduce the first harvest yield after application in 2010 and 2011, although in 2011 it was not statistically significant. But from the previous graphs, you can see those plots actually did rebound, and the total yield for the year was no different than the plots treated by Roundup. As far as my conclusions, the herbicide application did improve alfalfa yield. You removed that competition from the weeds and supported more alfalfa growth. Longer cutting intervals, they improved several things. First, the total forage yield. You got both more yield when you combine the alfalfa and weeds. The alfalfa actually responded to the extended cutting interval by adding yield, where the weeds did not increase. So as you lengthen it, you're actually getting a greater proportion of alfalfa to weeds in the forage you harvest as you extend the cutting interval. The weed content higher in the earlier planting date, and this is likely because we're controlling a lot of those weeds between planting dates through tillage while we're preparing for the second planting. And finally, because of time, I didn't have enough room to show this, but quality increased with application of herbicide and shorter cutting intervals. And when I say quality, I mean increase in crude protein and lower fiber contents whenever you remove the weeds and you have pure alfalfa. And then the shorter cutting intervals, the less mature your forage is, you're going to increase the quality. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Marvin Hall, my committee members, William Curran and Harold Harpster, our technician, Justin Dillon, and the farm crew. We have the research farm for all their support. And finally, funding from Monsanto. With that, I would like to thank you and take any questions you have.
Questions for Kurt? What was your rate application of pursuit?
The application of pursuit?
Yeah, application rate.
We did in kilograms per hectare, but I think it came to around 4 ounces per acre.
You implied that the weeds are an anti-quality, but we've had speakers today that suggested weed quality was acceptable to the desired forage being grown in terms of animal nutrition.
Yeah. As far as the weed quality of within the forage that you're harvesting, with our data, we found that when you're including the weeds from one treatment, same cutting interval, same planting date, the controlled treatment had more fiber, less crude protein compared to a pure alfalfa. So in our case, the weed species I showed at least, it was decreasing the quality of the forage we were collecting.